Good morning, Frankfurt. I'm Amanda Cook, a member of Frankfurt VFW Post 1493. On behalf of the Post, welcome to our Memorial Day ceremony. We welcome our esteemed guests to include our Mayor, Keith Ogle, Deputy State's Attorney, Ken Gray, the Hickory Creek Middle School Symphonic Band, and their instructors, as well as you, the residents who help us honor the fallen each year on this somber day. On Memorial Day, we remember those who died in service to our nation. We have gathered here in tribute to those who made the ultimate sacrifice while serving in our armed forces, to whom we owe the deepest gratitude. Our ceremony will begin with a prayer from our post chaplain, Robert Easton.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for joining us today. Before the prayer, I said a few Memorial Day quotes. Your memory feels like home to me, so whenever my mind wanders, it always finds its way back to you. Renata Suzuki. Our nation owes a debt to its fallen heroes that we can never fully repay. President Barack Obama. For love of our country, they accepted death and thus resolved all doubts and made immortal their patriotism and their virtue. President James A. Garfield. Now, if you please bow your heads, I'm going to do a prayer to honor those who gave their lives. Lord God, with grateful hearts, we remember those who laid down their lives for the sake of others. Their sacrifice echoes the love your Son showed us, laying down his life so we could live. Today we honor their bravery and mourn the loss of each precious soul. Wrap your families in your comfort and remind us that freedom comes with a cost. Help us not take for granted the peace they secure. May we walk humbly, love deeply, and serve selflessly just as they did. Let their legacy live on through us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. I want to turn your attention to our post commander, Al Gutierrez, as he lowers the flag to half-mast as a sign of respect for those who have passed. Each year, we place a wreath below the flag on our memorial to the armed services, also in remembrance of those veterans who have passed. This year, the wreath is presented by Vicki Gress of the VFW Ladies Auxiliary. We will now hear the Star-Spangled Banner performed by the Hickory Creek Middle School Symphonic Band under the direction of Shannon Shanahan, Allison Bowman, and Doug Adams. Please stand. Wonderful job. Thank you for your performance. Our mayor, Keith Ogle, has prepared a special address for our community to be a part of this ceremony.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I am Mayor Keith Ogle. On this Memorial Day in Frankfurt, we gather to pay homage to our fallen veterans and to contemplate the immense sacrifices made by soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard members in service to our nation. The tradition of Memorial Day finds its roots in the aftermath of the American Civil War, where people began adorning the graves of fallen soldiers with flowers, a practice that spread throughout the nation. In 1868, General John Logan, then Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army in Washington, officially designated May 30th as the inaugural Memorial Day, marking the graves of fallen soldiers at Arlington Cemetery. Over time, Memorial Day has evolved to honor all departed veterans. In 1971, the United States Congress formally recognized Memorial Day as a national holiday to be observed on the last Monday in May. As we stand here today, the Frankfurt community, though just 13 years old at the time of the first Memorial Day, continues to uphold the tradition by adorning the graves of veterans in our local cemeteries. Today, we not only honor the memory of those who have passed, but also the values that drive the individuals to serve in the military. Our nation owes an immeasurable debt to the brave men and women of our armed forces who sacrifice the comforts of home and family to safeguard and defend the United States. Today we pay tribute to our fallen heroes and express our gratitude to those currently serving, praying for their safe return. I extend my heartfelt thanks to the VFW members for their unwavering dedication to supporting our service members and their families. I also extend gratitude to the Hickory Creek Middle School Band and their talented musical directors, Doug Adams, Allison Bauman, and Shannon Shanahan, for their musical contribution to today's ceremony. We acknowledge Chief Leanne Chalepis and the Frankfurt Police Department, as well as the Frankfurt Fire District, for their presence and participation today. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of trustees Maura Rigoni and our clerk Katie Schubert. As we pause from our daily routines this Memorial Day, let us reflect on the blessings of living in a free nation and acknowledge the ongoing sacrifices made by our sons and daughters in defense of our liberty. We express our deepest appreciation to those currently serving in the armed forces, to those who have served before, and to those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. May God bless America and all her service members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Ogle. The Honorable Ken Gray, Chief Deputy State's Attorney, will read the names of deceased veterans from Frankfurt buried at Abraham Lincoln, Pleasant Hill, Rose Hill, and Skyline cemeteries, as well as elsewhere.
Good morning. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Mayor. It's always an honor. I'm very humbled to be here on this Memorial Day remembrance with everyone and read the names of those veterans who lived in Frankfurt or Frankfurt Township and who have since passed away. I also want to thank VFW Post 1493 and all that they do, not only in service our country, but our community in their honor. Thank you, Mayor Ogle, for continuing on this beautiful Memorial Day of remembrance and for your words. I say remembrance, for it is a day to remember all of those who have served our wonderful country. It is a day to remember those who have served who were injured both physically and emotionally in our country's fight for continuing freedom and liberty, and to especially remember those who paid the ultimate price for those same principles. It is often but said that freedom is not free. Indeed, it is not. The selfless act of serving one's country is a noble pursuit, and we are forever grateful for those who are willing to give their all, even if it means laying down their own life for our freedoms. I am honored and humbled to carry on this great tradition of reading the roll of those who have served in our branches of the military and have passed on, which began with Mayor George Sangmeister many decades ago, and carried on by his son, former Congressman George Sangmeister, who was one of my mentors when I was just a little lad, and then as I became an attorney, I became law partners with him. Congressman Sangmeister was indeed the moving member of Congress who established the Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery and is currently buried in its hallowed ground. By the way, if there's anyone here who is aware their name should be added to our list, please feel free to contact myself, Amanda, the Village of Frankfort, or you're welcome to come up afterwards or before, as we were adding about 5 names this morning that I got just as I got here. But it's important that they be recognized, and we are happy to do that and try and make it as easy as possible. The reading of the roll. These are the names of those who have served our country with honor and distinction and are buried at Rose Hill Cemetery. Edwin Brandow, George Brandow, Lloyd W. Brandow, Ronald O. Elwell, Russell Elwell, George Heisner, Arthur Conrad Mark Jr., Frank Mark, Walter Mark, Henry Ross, Jacob Ross. Those buried at Abraham Lincoln Cemetery: Wendell Anderson, Thomas M. Allen, Ronald William K. Atkinson, Neil M. Baker, Janet Bates, Michael Allen Beebe, David Lee Benson, John H. Benson, Albert O. Bashansky, Brian J. Malecki, Sonny Blackburn, George E. Blass, William G. Blocker, Albert M. Bodine, Wayne Bracken, Leonard J. Brainer, Glenn A. Bruce, Gary P. Cheatham, James Clark, Thomas A. Cole, George J. Coles, Clark Cookingham, Robert L. Chrissy, Louis Chakowski, Bob L. Dalton, Marty G. Delisman, Richard A. DeWolf, Gilbert DeRazio, John E. Dunham, Reggie Ellisons, Tim Engstrom, D.C. Epperson, Joseph G. Every, John E. Fadak Jr., Daniel J. Filipiak, David H. Finnegan, Herschel J. Floyd, Charles Foote, Francis X. Gayon, Robert W. Garrett, Edward J. Geisler Jr., John A. Globke, Tara D. Graveline, Frank Oliver Gray Jr., William D. Griffith Sr., Leonard A. Ham, Chester E. Hinkowski, John J. Hanson, Calvert E. Heath Jr., Joseph G. Hubbard Sr., Vincent L. Herman, Robert A. Herrick, Leonardus H. Hine, Gerald W. Howard, Patrick C. Jesse, Clarence Jones, Patrick H. Jordan, Kenneth W. Kaiser, Robert Arthur Campy, Eugene Kameg, Carl W. Cowling Jr., Charles E. Condas, William H. Krosky, John L. Kuhnhart, James G. Lally, Joseph A. Lentese, John Lindemulder, Thomas P. Mankowski, Robert L. Mansell, Charles P. Margeron, Anthony Marine Jr., Thomas P. Martin, Richard M. Matlaws, Lyle MacArthur, W. Stevens McCarthy, Robert T. McGill, Edward I. Melby, Donald R. Melcher, John Murch, Rusty Meyer, George R. Mistro, William J. Mix, Martin J. Mobeck, Robert H. Moore, Larry Morgan, Hans D. Mosh, George D. Moyle, James R. Murray Sr., Raymond Miskovitz, James L. O'Brien, Michael Ray O'Brien, Howard L. Pample, Kilo Panici, Hedrick E. Partee, Frank Pacetto, Bobby L. Petrala, Michael J. Pasturzi, Bruce R. Plesh, Ralph G. Port, Ronald J. Porter, Mel G. Provencher, Thomas A. Putman, Philip J. Raven, Ronald C. Reed, Frank Renz, Morgan W. Roderick, Richard S. Roscoe, Thomas L. Saindon, George E. Sangmeister, John W. Scanlon, Donald L. Schofield, Ronald A. Senesac, James H. Sexton, Dale L. Sherwin, George W. Schultz, Leroy A. Skinkus, Richard Skopik, Gary Smith, Vincent A. Sola, Stephen J. Salaba, Chester Soltise, Colin E. Sorensen, Gerald C. Squira, Tom Stack, John R. Stack, Cyril Strezzo, Antonio Sutera, Frank J. Scalish, Darrell Smith, Raymond Smith, Ronald H. Smith, William Smith, Eric Spengler, Tom Stack, Robert L. Stanek, Stanley Staton, Arnold J. Steves, Chester Saponik, Roy Stellwagen, James R. Stern, Meade Stuckey, Richard Chernovic, Fred Surya, Donald Swanberg, George R. Swanberg, Matt Szymanski, Joseph Talisperry, Antonio Tortorici, Bruno F. Trento, Martin Tuck, Alexander Melvin Turner, Sylvester Tyler, Arthur Vancura, Willard Van Eck, Henry Van Winkle, Thomas Vogler, Edward Vollrath, Lambert Vollrath, John Wagner, Curtis L. Waldvogel, William Walker, Jeremiah Wall, James Warren, Charles Weber, Cheryl Whitebrook, Fred B. Wietendorf, Andrea Wershing, William White, Everett Whitmore, Charles Wingler, John L. Wiat, Henry V. Wood, Joseph Zamotich, Paul Zenzina, Skyline Cemetery, Gerald Abbey, Arthur E. Anderson, Alexander A. Antusis, Melvin Bartels, Eugene Batson, William Batson, Melvin Bernardi, James A. Bernero, William Blau, Edward Brown, Leland Dalton, John P. DeVos, Glenn E. Farrell, Herbert B. Hardy, Clarence Harms, Milton W. Harms, Edward L. Hartley, Irvin Holm, Frederick Holzapfel Sr., Henry Hosbach, Frederick H. Kook, Leroy Kluth, George Martin, Donald C. Myers, Harry E. Miller, Ernest J. Novilli, Glenn Nissen, Oliver F. Pass, Fred K. Paxton, James A. Raffoff, Frank Sartori, Harold Ellsworth Schiffler, Gottfried Chinkowski, Orwell Chinkowski, Howard J. Seaman, William D. Shanafelt, George F. Schaus, Donald E. Stephen, John Joseph Tyler, Casimir M. Wotak, Vincent N. Zeranti, Andrew Zink, those buried elsewhere, Jerome K. Ackert, Donald H. Eggleston, Leland B. Alderson, Fermi A. Alderson, John Alfano, Rudolph Y. Allegrucci, Kenneth A. Allen, Thomas M. Allen, Gus Anagnos, Herman S. Anderson, Nels Anderson, Robert L. Anderson, William J. Andrisiak, John P. Angelus, James R. Angio, Timothy J. Arman, Clarence H. Bach, Richard Bacino, Al Baggs, Gregory Ballett, James Ballett, Norbert Ballett, Harold Baldacci, Melvin A. Bartels, Robert T. Baxter, Hugo Becker, Chester Bellowin, Joseph A. Bella, Ernest H. Bennett, David Lee Benson, Catherine L. Berkery, Batista Bertoletti, Robert C. Besson, William L. Blakemore, John C. Blansett Sr., Norton Blaylock, Richard J. Bach, Warren Harold Bach, Edward J. Badong, Jack Bone, Thomas F. Bolin, Harold A. Borman, Eugene Brackman, William S. Bradford, Paul Brandow, Marvin F. Bremer, Leo B. Brennan, Melvin R. Brink, Henry C. Brinkmeyer, Richard D. Bruno, August O. Butcher, Alice M. Buddy, Phil Bundy, Angelo J. Caliendo, William Thomas Campbell, Don V. Cap, John F. Caparelli, Paul M. Carlson, John G. Cernauskas, Paul Chamberlain, Jack D. Chiappetta, John E. Corley, Patrick F. Connolly, Cornelius J. Cook, Jack Cook, Noah W. Crane, Frederick Cross, Edward E. Crowder, Joseph P. Cryan, James P. Cummings, Joseph B. Currier, Alan J. Curry, Lawrence Chaswitz, James N. Daly, Albert L. Diefenbach, Frank E. David, George E. Davies, Gino DeRay, James J. Delaney, William V. DeLauder, David P. Detmer, Neil O. DeVore Sr., Frederick H. Dinger, Dominic Giglionia, Thomas H. Donovan, Russell A. Dubrawa, Stanley Charles Douglas, Francis Doyle, John Dorsch, John A. Duncan, John DeRocker, Wilbur F. Earhart III, Gene R. Ellis, Thomas Edward Ellis, Alan P. Engelhart, Harry L. Engeldow, Robert J. Erdy, Andrew M. Evans, Walter S. Farron, Lee W. Filippo, David H. Finnegan, Nicholas Fisher, Herman Fleischem, Henry Flenchy, Frank Felici, Thomas J. Frangella, Herman L. Frank, James Freeman, William A. Friedel, Garetano Kenneth Foucault, James Robert Garofalo, Warren H. Garrett, Anthony S. Gasbaro, Frank Robert Giamato, Dale Janens, Eugene J. Girardi Sr., Ricardo A. Girardi, Harry M. Gerkitz, John G. Jernauskas, Ted Gerndt, Frederick J. Glatz, Edward Golden, John Golden, Trevor Golden, Sebastian Gonlag, Carl G. Gren, Leonard B. Gromnicki, Edward Gross, Leo H. Krasuski, George A. Dad, Lord R. Hall, William J. Halperin, James W. Hanna, William C. Hardy, Ernest A. Hargison, Raymond Harms, Daniel P. Hatton, Charles E. Hecht, Calvin A. Hine, Lawrence Hobson, Lester R. Hochhalter, John Hogan, Lawrence Hogan, Leo Thomas Hogan, William R. Hoffulson, Leon Holman, Edward Hooten, James J. Horvath, Robert W. Rara, Dean Paul Hoolhorse Sr., Lawrence A. Estelle, Margaret Estelle, John S. Ivers, Robert Yan, Michael J. Jomrak, Ignatius J. Janusik, William R. Jensen, Albert Johnson, James W. Johnson, John W. Johnson, Walter J. Johnson, Ray Jones, Norman W. Judas, Richard Kazmarski, Wayne Karstensen, Edward J. Kasarskas Sr., Herman G. Kautz, Ronald J. Keene, Herman J. Kaiser, James C. Keeler, Richard Keller, Thomas Kellerman, James J. Kelly, Thomas K. Kennard, Edward R. Kewandowski, John King, Richard Klotz, Leroy Marvin Cluth, Henry Kamak, Barney F. Kamak, Eugene Kamek, Orville Knierim, Joseph G. Kordick, Jerry E. Kovar, Stanley J. Kozasik, Joseph R. Crow, Stanley Kresmer, Harold G. Crone, Robert Cross, Stephen F. Kubek, Andrew Kiebrick, Robert A. Koo, Dennis J. Kuda, Howard George Larson, Roy Larson, William R. Lawrence, Lester L. Lair, Dominic Leonardo, William Lester, Gerald E. Lichtenwalter, Carl Lindy, David Lindstrom, Raymond E. Jordan. No, that's not right. Raymond E. Lorden, John P. Luskus, Walter Frank Madsen, Marvin A. Mager, Michael Mahoney, Donald W. Myhart, Richard A. Mongo, Gerald W. Mark, Pete A. Markunis, Louis P. Masidi Jr., Samuel Matthews III, James C. McCarthy, James McCauley, Billy G. McClard, Robert McCann, John Otis McCleary, Frank C. McClenahan, James G. McElroy, John R. McKendry, James McLemore, Joseph Madrano, Robert Mears, Gerlando Malai, Louis D. Menigan, Robert Mensick, George E. Merica, James Marion, Gerald Messick, Tom L. Metz, Joseph Metzger, Michael Mikas, Robert Mills Sr., Bobby Mills Jr., Paul Miskovitz Jr., Russell Morgan, Warren Mankey, Bernard L. Mandela, Gerald R. Mankowski, Charles P. Margeron, Lawrence Marquardt, Robert Martinson, Wayne Massey, Ira Maynard, Ralph C. Matuziak, Michael L. McCoos, Mark Madigan Jr., Frank Mondry, Henry J. Matul, James Moy, Hans W. Muller, Arthur C. Mullen Jr., Bruce A. Mullen, Vito Murabito, Robert E. Murphy, Douglas Mervine, John Leo Naraki, Joseph Nichols, Nicholas J. Nijakowski, Everett H. Nissen, John Norchel, Ben Novilli Jr., Edward Oclea, Lawrence E. Oglesby, Morris Ackerland, Henry J. Oliveri Sr., Robert E. O'Neill, Robert J. O'Mara, Theodore Osich, Paul Oswald, Douglas Osborne, Lawrence A. Paha, Joseph J. Palanese, Rudolph Piloto, Raymond Carl Perello, Mario J. Pascarella, Philip Pascarella, George F. Pasquier, Rudolph Pavlaka, Leonard Pearson, Leonard H. Pechtold, Casimir Pekulis, Bruce R. Pegrin Sr., William Peters, John A. Peterson, David R. Phillips, Charles Pizanka, Angelo Pisturzi, Frank A. Plesser, Edward J. Polito, Edward F. Preuser, sorry about that, Scott B. Price, James H. Prince Sr., Henry F. Prokosky, Francis B. Puliz, Joseph Puliz, Louis A. Rebelhofer, William Rankin Sr., Charles A. Reddy, Paul M. Rebus, Ronald C. Reedy, John P. Reedy, Irwin H. Reimer, Alex A. Rembus, Catherine M. Reynolds, Frederick M. Reister, Lee R. Rinker, Walter Ritt, Manuel C. Rod, Daniel J. Romer, Patrick Rogers, William M. Rogue, Donald S. Rozalowski, John E. Rossi, Rivaldo T. Rossini, Robert Roth, Dominic Rotondo Jr., Louis Stanley Rudnicki, Pompeo Ruggieri, Ronald Rezka, Don Sabatino, Robert S. Sadak, Charles F. Samek, Albert L. Saviano, Matt Sako, Rodney Schaefer, John J. Schilling, Joe Schmidt, Alfred Schrank, Roy Schuck, George R. Schultz, David A. Schump, Harold Schwab, Frank Stanley Sedzilars, John Selheimer, William I. Shanafelt, Thomas C. Shannon, Walter J. Shatkus, Albert R. Shaw, Francis G. Sheridan, Charlie Shields, Jim Shields, Ralph J. Show, Paul R. Schult, George Shutak, George D. Shutak, Frederick A. Siekman, Eric P. Simmons, Gordon E. Slade, Walter J. Smilek Jr., Charles R. Smith, Dudley H. Smith, Paul J. Sosnowski, Sylvester S. Sosnowski, Joseph Sotosanto, Roger W. Southard, Ronald J. Spezia, Daniel R. Spur Jr., Stade, Michael R. Stanich, Ivan Stankiewicz, Lawrence John Stasatis, William Staton, Gerald Stillman, Roderick W. Story, Clarence Stunkel, Leonard Stunkel, William Stunkel, Benedict H. Staracco, Thomas Drader, Ronald R. Stromberg, Melvin Suttream, Larry Schubert, Bernard Sunberg, Robert Sweeten, Donald Swinford, Albert R. Sylvester, Joseph J. Zarmak, that's Joseph J. Zarmak, John Edward Taylor, Michael M. Thompson, Art Thompson Jr., William R. Talameri, Philip Tilth, R. Harold Trezes Sr., Albert C. Treble Jr., Henry A. Tumbarello, Stanley A. Tylinski, Lawrence L. Unger, Dominic Benuzzo, Joe A. Villarreal, Matt Valutis, William Wace, Andrew Walchek, William J. Walker, Fred A. Wallerstedt, William M. Walsh, Ralph D. Ward, Clement W. Warner, Robert Warren, James Weingartner, John T. Welling, Howard Werner, Walter Werner, Charles Wirt, Emil Willie, Howard Willis, Anthony C. Williams, Matthew David Williams, Wayne F. Worth, Lester E. Wesky, Ronald W. Yates, Van Earl Yunker, Theodore J. Zane, Lowell F. Zimmerman. Twinning Cemetery, Andrew Barge, Howard W. Duke, Uriah Hardy, Andrew T. Holm, Edwill A. Rabb. Frankfurt Cemetery, Frank Abbott, George Bussey, Donald Carroll, Eugene Eisenbrandt, Melvin Eisenbrandt, Andrew Eisenbrandt, Richard G. Folletti, Harry E. Gibson, Ted Gibson, Clifford Griswold, Walter Hawkinson, Glenn G. Jacobs, Joseph Mashkin, Dalton Miller, David William Nelson, Frank J. Reitz, Edward Stippen, Harold J. Wingler, Joseph M. Zimmerman, Pleasant Hill Cemetery, Nick Aducci, Irby J. Albright, Nick Altavia, Jimmy John Altavia, Stephen Amir, Alma Bailey, John Bailey, Anthony Ballencount, Julius A. Barnes, Richard Barnes, Kenneth Baumberg, Norman W. Baumgartner, Victor K. Beckman, Louis Belcher, Edward H. Bells, Clarence W. Bennett, Robert R. Bennett, Raymond Bettenhausen, John N. Benetti, Cyril Blackwell, Thomas Blaney, Kenneth Bloomer, Stanley Bobson, Henry P. Bach, Jerry C. Bach, Donald Betcher, Arthur Bogaz, Kenneth Boonstra, Sam Brenlinger, Norman Bree, Joseph Balzira, Edward Bukowinski, Ruth Burns, Leonard R. Busen, John Caldwell, Evelyn Canterbury, Ray Canterbury, Carl Cardinal, Lenore Cardinal, Donald Carlson, Kenneth Carlson, Mac Carson, Horace N. Cachetta, Stephen Chambers, Walter J. Cheney, Lloyd Cleveland, William Cleveland, Kenneth Cohn, Terry L. Coisart, Robert Crutchfield, Thomas A. Curran, Chester Zernata, Anna P. Dagan, William J. Dagan, William Dangel, Albert L. Diefenbach, Russell Leon Davis, Donald DeHart, Jacob DePorto, Harry Diarco, George Durcavito, Cornelius DeWitt, Gordon K. Dillon, Klaus P. Ditchler, William Dugan, Ambrose Doty, Robert P. Desden, Ralph Drolly, Bruce Ebert, Chester Ebert, Edmund Ebert, Jack L. Edmondson, John C. Ellis, George Robert Elsner, Eric H. Erickson, Azell Erickson, Robert D. Evans, Michael Falachek, Joseph Ficker, Herbert P. Folkers, Herbert Folkers Jr., Johnson Folkers, Dale Fordyce, Ronald D. Fox, Ronald J. Fredericks, Robert Fredine, Robert Fry, Leonard Fries, Robert E. Fritz, Fred Fulsang, Robert M. Gaba, Udell W. Gay, Delmer Janens, Donald Janens, Harry Janens, William Janens, Earl Gierman, Sam Giordano, John W. Glisson, James M. Grady, Donald R. Graves, Alvin Gullickson, William Guzika, Conrad Hawkinson, Emil T. Haas, Sam Hageman, Richard Hansen Jr., Henry Harnack, Ronald W. Harnack, Roland Hatcher, Bernard J. Hauser, Joseph Hebard, William Hecht, Charles Hegan, Melvin A. Hine, Clarence Heisner, Roy M. Hensley Jr., Raymond Hernandez, Ralph Leonard Hitz, Charles Hornback, Walter Horton, Harry Hodgkin, Robert Dean Hull, John Henry Yeager, Leonard Japp Jr., Leroy Yarko, Gary Johnson, George H. Johnson, Kenneth Johnson, Olaf A. Johnson, Roy Johnson, Joseph B. Jolly, John Keller, Frank Kerr, Joseph Kerwin, Warren W. Keek, Dennis Kimsey, Rupert Kinnery, Thomas Kinnery, Orville Knierim, William Knipple, Robert Kolar, Stanley Kostecki, John Kotas, Frank Kovar, Leslie Kraft, Irvin A. Kruger, Richard J. Krenicki, John Coos, Albert M. Lally, James Albert Larimore, George Leffler, John Leffler, Wendell M. Leffler, Frank Ligero, Frank E. Ligero, Maynard W. Lugert, Glenn Lewis, Troy Lyerly, Klaus Peter Lichtenfeld, Bruno Liento, James Edward Logan, George Ludolph, Lloyd P. Luring, Edgar Lund, Robert O. Lundquist, John Maddox, Andrew J. Melito, James McCarthy, James McDermott, Charles McMiniman, Francis J. McNally, Thomas Myers, George Martin Mickelson, Michael Micas, Robert W. P. Mitchell, John C. Moulter, John Matea, Henry J. Montel, Louis Marino, Ralph E. Morrison, Charles L. Mosca, Fred Muff, James Munch, Jack Munger, Wilfred Niedringhaus, Robert Newgren, Ralph Neeland, Ronald H. Nevada, Donald H. Oliveri, Charles Olson, Philip J. Ortegal, William Osman, David Parks, Charles L. Pasca, James A. Patterson, Leonard Peterson Jr., Herbert E. Phillips, Clarence Piper, Emmerich J. Pillar, Marion J. Pamakala, Wayne Price, James Pyle, Clarence J. Radke, Russell Ragsdell, Robert Reka, Albert Redmond, Fred Reimers, William Reimers, Jack A. Rinaldi, Daniel Rarica, Robert Reynolds, James Rice, Ronald Rimkus, David Roberts, William Robinson, Earl Rousseau, Eris Rudman, Dr. Irving Rudman, William J. Rung, Frank R. Staletta, Brent Sanders, Darrell Sanders, Julius J. Sandy, Paul Scaldetta, James J. Scanlon, Richard T. Shedicke, Rodney Schaefer, Herbert J. Shute, Alan Schramm, Norbert Schroeder, George Schultz, Earl Scott, Delbert F. Seaman, Percy Severson, Forrest Shaw, Clarence Ciano Jr., Raleigh V. Sinks, Woodrow Simmons, Frank F. Sinnott, Scott C. Scotland, John Valenti, Richard C. Wagner, Paul Wessel Jr., Emmanuel S. White, Walter G. Rusbicki, Dr. Laverne Smith, Richard Trevarthen, Ronald Ziolkowski. That concludes the reading of the roll. May God bless them, their families, and continue to bless this incredible country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. You always do an excellent job honoring Frankfort's veterans this way. A few notes before our final salute. After the conclusion of this ceremony, the VFW Rifle Squad will conduct 3 more rifle salutes at Frankfort Township, Pleasant Hill, and Skyline cemeteries. The Frankfort VFW's Rifle Squad will now present a 21-gun salute to the fallen, followed by taps played by Allison Bauman. Please stand. You may now be seated. Thank you all for attending this ceremony and honoring our fallen and deceased veterans. Your participation in this important tradition means a lot to us and to their families. Please enjoy the rest of your holiday. Thank you for attending.